All right. So to start off with today, we're going to be talking about the Atlantic slave trade and kind of how the Atlantic slave trade got started, why the Atlantic slave trade got started. And what I want you to do is there's 6 questions that are on the board. I'm going to go ahead and give you the opportunity to write those down. Those will be on your notes for today that I'll grade on Friday when I come around, do a notebook check. We'll answer these as we go through the class. So you should have them all finished before we get out of here. And we'll kind of make sure that we get exactly what it is. I'm gonna try to.
This is something that we learned I still haven't done this before.
It should be.
How was it like America to like
Huh?
England down to Africa back to America?
Yeah. Yes, sir. It just gets fast forwarded to about the year 1860 as compared to the origination of it is the other, but yes, it should be something that you are doing over the time of 6th, 8th grade through. So I'm going to read these 6 questions to the people recording right there. What was the history of slavery before 1492? Why did Europeans begin importing slaves into the Americas? Describe the growth of slavery in the Americas. What was triangular trade and how did it work? And what was slavery like in the Americas? What were the effects of the Atlantic slave trade? Those are going to be the 6 questions that we'll go over today. While you're writing this down, usually whenever I do this section of it, I put 4 desks together up here at the front of the room. And then we have, I guess, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. There's 12 kids that volunteer. And we put the desks together to where there's 4 kids underneath the desks. There's 4 kids laying in the desk, and there's 4 kids on top of the desk. And they stay there for 45 minutes through the entire lesson that goes through it. And what it does, it gives like the closest simulation to traveling on a slave trade ship that you could be. And, you know, you just think about how annoying it is for 45 minutes to be in that position, laying on the ground, uncomfortable, laying in a chair, having somebody else on top of the deck there. And we'll kind of get to this instance here in a little while. But you think about traveling like that for 4 months, rather than just the 45 minutes you'd have to be there through a class deal. And it's pretty interesting, you know, just the level of comfort we have versus some of the situations that people were put in previous times in history. But it's pretty interesting. We'll kind of get to some reasons why it's even worse than what you can kind of imagine it would be. There's also going to be some, you know, kind of interesting parts of maybe you didn't know about, you know, how slave trade began with Africa to the West Indies, to the Americas, kind of, and why it was successful. That's going to be a big deal. So I'm going to start reading to you a little bit here just to give an introduction while you're going through this first part. Sugar plantations and tobacco farms require a large supply of workers to make them profitable for their owners. European owners had planned to use Native Americans as a source of cheap labor. So they were going to travel from Europe, conquer the people that were there, and just use them as the close relative labor source. That was going to be the easy way. But millions of Americans died from disease, warfare, and brutal treatment. We showed that on Monday or last week whenever we were talking about the population decline in the Americas, right, and how much of the people were decimated by disease and warfare. Therefore, the Europeans in Brazil, the Caribbean, and southern colonies of North America soon turned to Africa for workers. This demand for cheap labor resulted in the brutalities of what would be the slave trade. Beginning around 1500, European colonists in the Americas who needed cheap labor began using enslaved Africans on plantations and farms. Slavery had already existed in Africa for centuries. It had also existed all over the world for centuries. All right, so slavery wasn't anything new. It was a part that was integrated into society. Okay, it wasn't something that was wrong with society during that time. It was what you did to make your empire, to make your country more profitable than the other country. You conquered someone, you enslaved them, you made them work for you. Okay. And then the course of humanity has changed to where essentially that practice was outlawed, okay, for the better of humanity. So the first question, what was the history of slavery before 1492? What would your answer be on that? What's that? That was a normal part of society. Slavery was part of normal society, existed all over the world before 1492. In most regions, it was relatively minor institution. The spread of Islam into Africa during the 7th century, however, ushered in the increase in slavery and the slave rule. Muslim rulers in Africa justified enslavement with the Muslim belief that non-Muslim prisoners of war could be bought and sold as slaves. As a result, between 650 and 1600, Muslims transported nearly 17 million Africans to the Muslim lands of North Africa and Southwest Asia. Okay, so 17 million people in Africa were already being displaced by people of Islam faith because, again, that was part of society. Okay, in most African and Muslim societies, slaves had some legal rights, an opportunity for social mobility. And in the Muslim world, a few slaves even occupied positions of influence and power. Now, that's the biggest difference between, kind of what it was like in the Americas. There wasn't going to be an opportunity to get out of slavery. There wasn't going to be an opportunity to advance and move into power. There wasn't an opportunity to marry into power that was there. Some served as generals in the army. In African society, slaves could escape their bondage in numerous ways, including marrying into the family that they actually served for. The first Europeans to explore Africa were the Portuguese in the 1400s. Initially, Portuguese traders were more interested in trading gold than for captured Africans. They changed with the colonization of the Americas as the native people began dying by the millions. Europeans saw advantages to having Africans in America. First, many Africans had already been exposed to the European disease and had built up immunity. They'd already been trading for many years, okay? Europeans, Africans, people in Southwest Asia, people to Asia. They had already had interaction with each other from trading for many years. So the Eastern Hemisphere diseases were not a shock to them like the Eastern Hemisphere's diseases were a shock to the Native Americans of the Western Hemisphere. So, second, many Africans had experience in farming and could be taught plantation work. They already knew what to do because they were still back in agricultural times. The idea of the Neolithic Revolution, the agricultural revolution, pretty much still going on. All right, so they knew how to work. Third, Africans were less likely to escape because they did not know their way around this new land. Travel across the ocean for 4 months, get to the Americas, whether you're on an island, whether you're on the colonies, whether you're in South America, it looks nothing like Africa, okay? And you've kind of been disoriented for 4 months, split away from your family, have nobody to kind of tie yourself to. Fourth, their skin color made it easier to catch them if they escaped and they tried to live among other people, all right? So there was a definitive difference between skin color of people from Africa and people that were native to the Americas. So therefore, it was a designated idea. Now, this sounds, not correct politically wise, as far as in today's term and idea. But in all honesty, the way people from Africa were treated during this time period was much the same as how we treat livestock today, cattle. Any form of horse or dog or anything else, because it was for the idea to profit. It was for the idea to make a better model of the next one. Okay, for the idea of sell, the idea of work. The human value of the people from Africa that were brought over were taken out of it, and it was essentially like they were livestock to be traded. In time, the buying and selling of Africans for work in the Americas, known as the Atlantic slave trade, became a massive enterprise. Between 1500 and 1600, nearly 300,000 Africans were transported to America. By the time it was done in 1870, they had imported almost 9.5 million people. Okay. What does that do to Africa as a continent if you take 9.5 million people out of their continent and put them in another? Okay. Really skews the population line that's in there. Are you taking the weakest and most feeble people that they have? No, you're trying to find the strongest, all right, and the best that they have. So then that way you can demand more money through slave trade. So you're taking, 9.5 million, you're probably taking 60% of their best people that they have in the entire country, which in turn makes them more susceptible for future invaders, lacks the amount of farming that can go on in their continent, and extremely depletes the future of what Africa has a possibility of being based upon this. The Spanish took an early lead in importing Africans to the Americas. Spain moved on from the Caribbean and began to colonize the American mainland. As a result, the Spanish imported and enslaved thousands more Africans. By 1650, nearly 300,000 African laborers worked through Spanish American plantations for gold and silver mines. By this time, however, the Portuguese had surpassed the Spanish. By 1600, Brazil dominated the European market for sugar. As the colony's sugar industry grows, so did the European colonists and the demand for cheap labor. During the 17th century or 1600s, more than 40% of all Africans brought to the Americas were sent to Brazil. So that's another deal. In the beginning, not all slaves, kind of how we associate slavery is like the South, okay? Whenever slavery first began, it was the Caribbean. So Florida's here, and all of the islands that are in the West Indies, that are in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico going out to the Atlantic. That's where the majority of them were transported to. And then they were either sent south to South America, or they were sent north to what eventually would become the colonies once cash crops start going. As the other European nations established colonies in the Americas, their demand for cheap labor grew. Thus, they also began to import large numbers of Africans. So we looked at Jamestown yesterday. What was the largest amount of people that were transported from Europe to Jamestown? What were they? What type of people?
Unknown.
Okay, unknown could be one, but gentlemen was the most common one that we had an idea of what they were. So because gentlemen were there, they were people who did not work with their hands. Since they couldn't use the Native Americans there to work with their hands for them, they had to import people from other countries to do the work. As England's presence in the Americas grew, it came to dominate the Atlantic slave trade. From 1690 until England abolished the idea of slavery in 1807, it was the leading carrier of enslaved Africans. By the time the slave trade ended, the English had transported nearly 1.7 million Africans to the colonies of West Indies. Okay. African slaves were also brought to what is now the United States. And nearly 400,000 Africans were sold to Britain's North American colonies. Once North America started to grow, it went all the way up to 2 million. Okay, so how did they get there? What was the overall idea? Okay. Number one, and what's kind of a common misconception on this part was Africa, like we said in the beginning, had already been trading Africans with other people from Africa. Okay, so slave trade had already been present in Africa. All right. Most of the time that we associate the word slavery, we automatically go to, like I said, plantation, Civil War, fast forward all the way to 1860s to 1865. Okay. This idea that Africans were already trading each other kind of gets lost in the mix of how it starts here. So, like we saw in History of Mankind, the Europeans didn't have to go into Africa to capture people. People from Africa brought other Africans to the coast and traded them with the Europeans on the coast. So it was very, very easy for them. You know what I mean? I mean, they didn't have to go inland and risk their life or do anything else. They just traded at the coast like it was another commodity that was there. So one tribe from Africa would be at war with another tribe from Africa. Once one tribe won, they captured that group. So instead of having to fight them over and over and over and over, they just sent them to the coast, sold them off for raw goods from Europe, profited, and then also profited by losing their biggest rival because they were going to a complete other continent 4 months away. Okay. That cycle continues over and over and over and over until eventually the person that is profiting off of the slave trade becomes captured in the slave trade because they continue to need more bodies. And when they continue to need more bodies and they run out, they eventually bite the hand that feeds them and ships them to the Americas. Okay. After being captured, African men and women were shipped to the Americas as part of a profitable trade network. All right. So this is triangular trade that's on the board. All right. So it says, let's see, number 3, describe the growth of slavery in the Americas. How would you describe the growth over the years of slavery in America? Did it go up? Did it go down? Did it go up and down fast or slow? Okay. And what speed? Very rapid. Okay. So describe the growth of slavery in the Americas. It was a rapid growth because of demand of workers. It was a rapid growth because of demand of workers. All right. The triangular trade. That's number 4. What was the triangular trade and how did it work? Basically, this is how it worked. Started at point 1. Okay. There were raw materials and raw goods in Europe that they would load up on a ship and they would take down to Africa. Then they would use those raw materials, whether it be a manufactured good already, whether it be guns, whether it be a textile, whether it be a product that was already created in Europe, and they would go to Africa and they would trade those goods to Africa for humans or slaves. Then they would travel over to the West Indies, to the Americas, and they would trade those humans for money, or they would trade those humans directly for sugarcane, for cash crops, for things that were going to be able to be taken back to Europe and start the cycle all over again. Okay. So triangular trade was Europe to Africa, the Caribbean, back to Europe to Africa to the Caribbean. Sometimes they would cut out this and they would trade back and forth here for money for humans, back and forth. Okay. But most of the time, this is the thing that is known as what is triangular trade? How did it work? Europeans took raw goods. They sent it to Africa for humans and slaves. They sent the humans and slaves to the Caribbean for sugar. And they sent sugar back to Europe. And the cycle starts all over again. Okay. So for like number 4, you can just draw this. You can draw that down. Just make sure you know what that means whenever you do draw this on your paper. And this triangular trade happened from 1451 all the way essentially up to 1870. This will vastly change the population of the Americas, especially the Caribbean. Over 40% of the people from the Caribbean were going to end up being, it says Dutch, French, and British people that the Dutch, French, and British brought over from Africa. The part of the Middle Passage, that's from point 2 to point 3, going across the Atlantic Ocean. That's the Middle Passage from Africa to the West Indies. That's known as the Middle Passage. So here's a little excerpt from a slave that was coming across through the Middle Passage, the voyage for 4 months, and kind of the inhumaneness that goes on. I was soon put down under the decks, and there I received such a salutation in my nostrils as I never experienced in my life. so that with the loathsomeness of the stench and crying together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat. But soon, to my grief, two of the white men offered me something to eat. And one, on my refusing, one of them held me fast by the hands and laid me across the windlass. So he was beaten, he was flogged until he essentially ate. Okay. So you think about this. You know, I was talking about being layered with people on the bottom of the desk, in the middle of the desk, and over the top of the desk. If someone's got to use the restroom, whether it be number one or number two, they're chained to where they're at, so they can't move freely about the cabin. Okay. You definitely don't want to be on the bottom, because then you get the remnants of number two and the remnants of number three. If someone gets sick from traveling across the ocean and used to being on land and they're seasick, you know, for 4 months worth of it, if they start throwing up, it goes still on the boat. It's in your quarters that are there. Okay. So you're essentially living in a tipped over porta john. You know what I mean? Does that make you hungry? No. So then you start to starve yourself, because naturally you don't want to eat because of what is the present availableness of your cabin state. But the thing is, the people that are taking you across the way, you want to make sure that you're as healthy as can be, so then that way they can garner the most amount of money. Now, they lost about 20% of every person that came over on these boats every time. They also got to the point of where, you know, you were living your life. You may have been married, you may have had children, you may have had a farm, and then all of a sudden you're captured, you're separated. Your wife and your children go on different boats, they go to different places. You don't know if you'll ever see them again. As you're going across, kind of the depression hits you for that long. You know, there were people that honestly would have rather and did jump overboard the ship and drown at sea than see what was on the other side of the landing of this boat. So, you know, something hopefully none of us ever have to experience. The only thing you can honestly kind of even somewhat relate the idea of slavery to back then to today would be like human trafficking. You know what I mean? But for the most part, in human traffickers, there's an opportunity at the other side. You know what I mean? There's a lot of times that it's not, but there's still a hope at times. So slavery in the end, and kind of showing what the difference of a human having to be treated like cattle and moved from place to place. Here's the idea of the Middle Passage. The voyage that brought captured Africans to the West Indies and later to North and South America was known as the Middle Passage. It was considered the Middle Passage because it was the middle of the triangular leg of the trade. Europeans trapped and packed Africans into the dark holdings of large ships. They endured whippings, they endured beatings from the merchants' hands, as well as disease that would sweep through. If someone had disease and they died, they were still chained together with that dead person that was there until on that 4-month voyage, those guys would periodically check back and forth and then take that person and discard them overboard. But there wasn't just moving to the next spot. You know what I mean? Many others committed suicide by drowning. Scholars estimate that roughly 20% of the Africans aboard each slave ship perished during the brutal trip. Africans who survived their ocean voyage faced a difficult life in the Americas. They were forced to work in a strange land. They were enslaved, and they had to cope with life in many different ways. Okay, so what was slavery like? We just kind of talked about that part there. In the beginning, it was harsh. It says upon arriving, they were auctioned off to the highest bidder. So basically, they were sold as cattle. After being sold, they worked in mines, fields, or as a domestic servant. Slave life was very grueling. Many lived on little food. They lived in small huts. They worked long days and suffered beatings whenever they didn't. In much of the Americas, slavery was a lifelong condition as well as a hereditary one. So the hope of, if you did have children, that they could do something different was not present. They were going to be born into. You also didn't have the hope that you would find a girlfriend, boyfriend, a husband, a wife. Most of the time, again, kind of like livestock, the strongest slave would be bred to the other strongest slaves. So then that way the next population would be better livestock. And again, all that sounds extremely inhumane, and luckily society has adapted and changed for the most part, since the 1600s, the 1800s. So the big thing you sit there and you think about is like, why didn't they rebel? Because if there's 100 or 200 people that are there and there's only 20 people that are governing them, that are running them on this plantation, why didn't they all just come together and rebel? Why do you think that they didn't overtake? Sometimes they did, but okay, they have guns. There's more powerful ammunition that's against them. What else?
They didn't know the land.
Yeah, they had no idea where they were. Completely different than what Africa was like on the coastal side, the Caribbean, Brazil, any of that. They've been disoriented for 4 months, and the hope that they were ever going to see their original lifestyle is probably gone. All right. So it's kind of danged if you do, danged if you don't, because you either die by trying to escape or you attempt to live your life as a slave and stay alive with food, shelter, and other people similar to you around you. Okay. They also couldn't really communicate with each other. If they broke up a tribe and they intermingled them with other people from different tribes, they didn't speak the same language. They might have already had prior skirmishes between each other. So there wasn't this cohesiveness to be able to use a group to be able to go against those people. To cope with the horrors of slavery, Africans developed a way of life based on their cultural heritage. They kept alive such things as their musical traditions and stories of their ancestors. Slaves also found ways to resist. Some made themselves less productive by breaking tools, uprooting plants, and working slowly. Thousands also ran away. Some slaves pushed their resistance to open revolts. There was a successful slave revolution, and we'll talk about it later on, the Haitian Revolution. The idea of defeating the French kind of giving up on sending more troops over. The only successful slave revolution that's really talked about a ton in history as far as that goes, based upon the teaks. But we'll get into it later. It says as early as 1522, about 20 slaves on Hispaniola attacked and killed several Spanish colonists. Later, the revolt occurred throughout the Spanish settlements all the way to the 1600s, the 16th century. Okay. The consequences of it. We talked about what's the effect of slave trade. All right. What's the overall part of slave trade? The easy part is it redistributed the population of the world. Okay. That was an effect of the Atlantic slave trade. It took millions of people from Africa and it put them in the United States. It put them in the Caribbean. It put them in South America. Okay. So that's the easy part of it. The other part is it decimated Africa because it took their best and put them in other countries that were there. It says they lost generations. They're young and able to the European traders and plantation owners. Of essentially the families were torn apart. They were unwilling to participate in the growth of the colonies. African slaves contributed greatly to the economic and cultural development. If Europe hadn't have had the African slaves that were there, they would not have profited because there was too many gentlemen. There wasn't the people that did the work. Okay. They would have had to adapt. That would have changed the society, but they didn't have to. So it didn't change the society. It says with the muscle, enslaved Africans brought their expertise, especially in agriculture. So they showed them kind of the same way that Jamestown wasn't going to survive based upon its agricultural idea. Africans brought more expertise to it. The influx of so many Africans to the Americans also left its mark on the very population itself. For the United States, Brazil, many of the nations of the Western Hemisphere today have either a substantial African descent or a mixed race population based upon bringing slaves over. Okay. So in the end, you should have been able to answer those 6 questions. It kind of gives us, again, an intro and idea of what the Atlantic slave trade was like. It was very brutal for the people from Africa. It ended up being instrumental in the success of Spain, Portugal, Europe itself to profit and continue to profit for itself, and lasted, right here for over 400 years the idea. But again, based upon society, that was the norm during that time, was enslaving humans. Wasn't necessarily moving them from one continent to the other across the ocean, because that was all brand new, because nobody had been in the position to before. Okay, anybody have any questions about anything? All right, you don't have a quiz today. All you have was those 6 questions, and make sure they got in your notes. Tomorrow we'll go over section 4. Thursday we'll watch History of Mankind, and I'll give you a test review, and then Friday we'll take our test on chapter 20. Okay.